All right, it's 12:02. We're going to go ahead and get started. Make sure we get everybody out of here on time. Thanks so much for joining us. So this conversation today is presented jointly by MCEA and Friends of the Boundary Waters. We are both 501c3 nonprofits. We do depend on donors like you for the fight ahead, and this is going to be a long-term fight. So please, we are putting links in the chat. Please do make a gift to both organizations today. And that's an important thing that we're asking of you. There's going to be a lot of other opportunities to get involved in this fight, but that's a big one. Today's webinar is, well, was inspired, I guess, by the Senate vote on the Boundary Waters last week. And we want to talk about what lies ahead. If you're here watching this, you probably are already somewhat aware of that Senate vote, and you're probably worried about the fate of the Boundary Waters. Our goal here today is to remind folks what we've been able to accomplish in the past with state law, which is a lot, and provide some clarity about what our state law tools are and how they might apply. And we will invite you to get involved in some efforts to improve state law as well. So I hope what you take away from this is that we have tools, we will continue to fight, and there are things that you can do to help. And it's a big fight. This is going to be over many years. This is not something that's happening in 6 months or 12 months. This is a multi-year fight. And so we need your support for those years. It's going to take a lot of resources. All of our webinars, including this one, are recorded and available to watch online on MCEA's YouTube page and on our website. So if you miss one, or if you want to share this one after it's over with some folks who couldn't make it, you can always find them in those places and then watch and learn at your own pace. Here is what we have planned for today. First, we want to get everybody up to speed on sulfide mining in Minnesota, where it's proposed, what happened in the US Senate, and what it means and doesn't mean for mining in Minnesota. We want to talk about our history of and what is right now our model for fighting sulfide mining using state law, and that's polymet. That's really our model for the moment, and what it might mean for twin metals. And then we want to answer your questions. So we'll hold 10 minutes at the end to answer your questions. I'll also do my best to pay attention and weave those answers in throughout if possible. Please submit questions using the Q&A button. The chat is not available, but the Q&A button will work. You can submit those to the panelists through that function. All right, so let's get started. I'm Catherine Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director of MCEA. I started at MCEA in 2010 as a lawyer fighting Polymet's copper-sulfide mine proposed near Lake Superior. I am proud to say that 15 years later, we are still holding that reckless proposal at bay. Our other guest today from Friends of the Boundary Waters is Chris Knopf. He is the executive director, and he has previously worked in environmental law and has devoted his career to fighting for natural resources and advocating for conservation efforts. Joy Anderson is also with us today. She's a supervisory attorney at MCEA. She leads our litigation against Polymet, which has now been rebranded as New Range. Joy is also involved in the fight against Twin Metals proposal near the Boundary Waters, as well as the Tamarack copper sulfide mine proposed by Talon in the Mississippi watershed. And last but not least, we have Aaron Clems, MCEA's strategy officer. Aaron has devoted much of his career at MCEA to raising public awareness about the distinct risks posed by copper sulfide mining, particularly to water, and also fighting efforts at the legislature to weaken Minnesota's environmental protections against mining pollution and other things. So welcome and thanks to all three of you for being here today. All right, let's start by setting the stage and briefly reminding people of how we got here. Okay, so why are organizations concerned about sulfide mining? A lot of you know this, so we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but some of you might be new to this issue and curious. So I think it's helpful for all of us to know what those risks are. First of all, we know that sulfide mining is not like taconite mining. It poses different risks. And one of those is acid mine drainage. So when you bring iron ore up to the surface, mix it with air and water, you get rust. If you bring sulfide ore, like the type that Twin Metals would mine, up to the surface, expose it to air and water, you get acid. And that poses risks to people, to wildlife, also increases the amount of toxic pollution that gets leached from a site. Moreover, that pollution can last for hundreds of years or even forever. It's a long-lasting pollution. It's not something that, once the mining's done, the pollution is gone. The pollution stays at the site for generations afterwards and needs to be managed. And if it's not or can't be, then that's a significant problem. There are also taxpayer risks. We have a lot of models of mining companies declaring bankruptcy, leaving town, leaving dirty sites. They've reaped the profits, but they have not paid for any of the cleanup or reclamation, which is a risk to all Minnesotans. And it's never been done safely. We really don't have models of clean sulfide mining operations anywhere in the world. And so all of these claims that we're going to do it differently in Minnesota, if that was true, it would be the first time because we don't have any of those mines now. So this is a big deal. We're very concerned about the risks to our water here in Minnesota. And moreover, we're concerned about the risks to all three watersheds. I'm going to show it real quick, a map here. There we go. All right, I'm going to make it bigger. There we go. So this is a map of the primary proposed copper nickel mines in Minnesota. So you have Twin Metals, which is the one we're hearing about lately, Polymet, and Talon. And what you note here is that the kind of grayish bluish areas are watersheds. So Twin Metals is in the Rainy River or the Boundary Waters watershed. And so that means that any pollution flowing from that site flows towards the Boundary Waters. Polymet is just inside the Lake Superior watershed. So that means that any pollution flowing from that site would flow towards Lake Superior. And Talon is the nickel mine that's proposed in the Mississippi River watershed. And any pollution from that one would flow towards the Mississippi River. And this is important because it means that at this point, copper nickel or copper sulfide mining poses a risk to every major watershed in Minnesota. And we are at the headwaters of some very important watersheds. So that's a big deal. All right, now I want to turn to our guests. Let's talk about this US Senate vote that everybody's been talking about. Chris, I'm going to turn to you. How did we get here with Twin Metals? What happened in the US Senate and what does it mean for mining in Minnesota?
Sure. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everyone for watching this webinar. You are an inspiration to us, everyone that supports protecting our water. So this has been a ping pong between the various administrations for upwards of a decade. And so in 2023, the Biden administration put in place protections on federal lands adjacent to the boundary waters. So 225,000 acres of federal lands adjacent to the boundary waters, copper nickel sulfide mining was prohibited. And so what House Joint Resolution 140 does is that it removes those protections on federal lands adjacent to the boundary waters in the Rainy River watershed. As Catherine mentioned, there are three watersheds implicated by these different mines. This is the Rainy River watershed.
All right. Sorry, I thought you were going to have a slide. I was waiting for that.
We could do that later, perhaps in the steps
Okay.
for
right.
that. So
okay, so that's what's happening at the federal level. But it's really important for people to remember that the state plays a very important role, a central one, in fact, in whether copper sulfide mining happens near the boundary waters or anywhere else in Minnesota. You have to have state permits and a state process. You cannot proceed without that. So let's unpack that a little bit. So I'm going to start with Joy. As our lead attorney on mining, Uh, can you walk us through, Joy, what is the process for a proposed sulfide mine to obtain state approval in Minnesota?
Yes, regardless of what happens at the federal level, there is a state process and it is not short. So, under Minnesota state law, first of all, any sulfide mine would have to go through an environmental impact statement, which is the highest level of environmental review and takes the longest time. First, you have a scoping process that decides what the review is going to cover. Then you have the review itself. And then you have a determination of whether that review was adequate. And if it wasn't, you have to go back and do some more stuff. So thinking about what the timeline might be on this, for the Talon nickel mine that Catherine had on the map there, they are currently in the EIS scoping process. And right now they are on year 3 of the scoping process. And we are expecting that probably there will be a scoping decision that says, this is what you have to study in environmental review, perhaps this year. And then even once you have the scoping decision, then you have to do the actual review. As another example for Polymet, it took about 4 years from the time that the scoping document was issued until the draft environmental impact statement was issued. So this is not a short process. And then, even after you have the environmental review just lays out what the impacts might be, right? It doesn't say this mine can go forward or this mine can't go forward. After you do the environmental review, you have to get permits. And for a large project like a sulfide mine, you are going to have lots of state permits. A really important one is the permit to mine, which governs basically the actions and how the mine is developed and operated at the mining facility. You're going to have a water pollution permit and an air pollution permit that sets limits on how much water and air pollution can be issued. And those are federal permits, but the federal government has delegated the authority to issue those permits to Minnesota. And so those are things that Minnesota does. Those are some of the major ones. And then there are a host of other kinds of permits. You need construction permits, stormwater, public waters, maybe, endangered species, all sorts of different kinds of permits. And those permits may take several more years to put out. Again, looking at the Polymet example, because that's the one we have, it took about 2 years from when the environmental review was finished to when the permits were issued. The permitting process is not perfect by any means, or our environmental review, but the important thing is that they create a lot of opportunities for the public and for organizations like ours to push back and make sure that there are real, meaningful regulations that are restricting what the mine can do, how it can pollute our natural resources. What this means for Twin Metals, just very, very briefly, Twin Metals would not likely be starting from scratch. They had already started the EIS scoping process. They started that in 2019, and they had several rounds of information exchange with DNR. However, that process was paused in 2022 when Twin Metals lost its federal mineral leases. DNR said, we're not going to work on this anymore. This project is not going forward. So that they did some work a few years ago. It's been put on hold and it would have to start back up again. I don't know whether, how much of that could be reused. Also notably, in the letter stopping the environmental review process, DNR said it had concerns about the location of the tailings facility for Twin Metals. And so I think the main thing to know here is this is not going to be fast at the state level. This is going to take a while.
All right, thanks. Okay, so I'm hearing this is a long process. And we also know that these permits can be litigated successfully, as history tells us. So I want to dig into that a little bit so we can understand what has worked in the past at the state level in terms of legal challenges. And I'm going to stick with you for a moment, Joy. One of the successful challenges that was brought by our organization and some of our partners, including Friends of the Boundary Waters and the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, was against the permit to mine, which is the primary permit issued by DNR. Can you tell us a little bit about what worked in that case?
Yes, for sure. So yes, the permit to mine is a really critical permit. It covers general mining operations, but really critically, it requires a reclamation plan for when the mine is closed. Obviously, they can't go back and put things the way they were. That's not possible. But the reclamation plan is supposed to mitigate some of the harms and ensure that mine waste is stored safely. The permit also requires financial assurance, so to make sure that the company has enough money set aside to actually do that reclamation plan. Our lawsuit challenged multiple things about the permit to mine, but the main one was this reclamation plan. PolyMet had this untested reclamation plan that said they could take this giant lake full of mining waste and water that was going to exist at the end of the mine, and that they would distribute little pellets of clay on the top of this lake, and they would magically all sink down to the bottom and create this beautiful impermeable blanket of clay that would protect the mining waste from all interactions with water and air, which, as Catherine noted, will turn them into acid. We did not think that there was enough support in the permitting process to show that this would work. And the Minnesota Supreme Court agreed with us and said, you have to take this back to the Department of Natural Resources. They have to do what's called a contested case hearing to gather evidence to see if this can be done. At the end of that hearing, an administrative law judge found that no, PolyMet's plan does not comply with Minnesota law. That was supposed to get referred to DNR, but because PolyMet has now said, hey, we would like to revamp our plan a little bit, that case has been put on hold. So the main takeaway there is that permit was issued in 2018. It is 2026. They do not have an operative permit to mine because we were able to look at what they had done and say, this is not going to work. This does not comply with the law.
All right, thanks. All right, another successful challenge that we had related to the NPDES permit. Aaron's been waiting patiently for his chance to jump in here. It's the NPDES, or the Clean Water Act permit. We often refer to it as the water permit. And this is the permit for discharge of pollutants under federal law. However, it is issued and administered by the state. And this was an interesting one because there were legal issues, but also I would say a lot of sort of scandal around this one that became big public relations issues as well. So Aaron, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened with the Clean Water Act permit?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. In 2023, the Minnesota Supreme Court overturned this, what's called a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, which is the name we give for Clean Water Act permits. And they're supposed to set limits on what kind of water pollution can come from a site. And it was overturned on a unanimous decision authored by a Republican-appointed justice. And I can't really stress how unusual this was. It's very rare that the Supreme Court rebukes an agency so directly as they did in this decision, as well as and unanimously overturning a decision by an agency. There's generally a lot of deference given to agencies to do the work, which often involves a lot of detailed science and engineering reports. And courts are generally unwilling to intervene unless there are clear danger signs that shows that the agency didn't do their work well. And in this case, they did, and they did so unanimously. And some of the key issues raised in that decision was that the decision to give a permit was arbitrary and capricious, is the legal term, because of efforts to keep concerns of federal EPA staff out of the public record. And those concerns came forward because the union representing those federal EPA staff leaked them to the press. And then they became part of the public record that way. Previously, the MPCA and EPA staff had agreed to let the staff members read those comments over the phone, but never submit them in writing. And so the public never saw them. All of these interactions between the agencies raised the suspicion of the court so much that they said, you know what, this is a reason why we have to overturn this permit. The public has been deprived of information that they should have been given about EPA's concerns. And some of those concerns included the impact on the downstream Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, who have their own tribal water quality standards that weren't adequately considered. Another issue that was considered in this case was whether Minnesota's state rules, which prohibit destroying groundwater or polluting groundwater, were violated. The company argued that inside of the boundaries of where the mine would be proposed, they didn't have to preserve the groundwater, but the court roundly rejected that argument and sent it back to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to determine whether they should be given a variance from that law. That's still pending in front of the MPCA, I might add. One of the things that was really important to note is that there was a concurring opinion that also was added on top of the unanimous decision, signed by 5 justices, so a majority of them, and authored by Justice Ann McKeague. And here are some quotes that are just worth savoring a little bit for those folks that were involved in this work, but also are illustrative of the problem of the process that happened that caused the court to overturn this permit. Quote, the EPA raised more than mere concerns with the MPCA's draft permit. The EPA identified specific inadequacies that, if left in the final permit, failed to protect the band standards. But the MPCA and the EPA reached an arrangement that ultimately kept any record of these inadequacies secret. The MPCA and the EPA sought to avoid public scrutiny and to hide the risk of illegal water pollution from the public eye. This secrecy is unacceptable. And the bottom line really here is that there are 3 primary issues that are likely to come up again in any litigation around a twin metals mine, and particularly a water pollution permit issued for one. One is tribal sovereignty. There is tribal treaty lands, but also tribal land downstream of these proposals that could be polluted. Number 2 is the interplay between the MPCA and the EPA. As Catherine noted, these are federal permits, but they're administered by state agencies. And so there is a back and forth between the federal and state agencies. And now we know we have to pay very close attention to that. And there can be some, we'll call them shenanigans that can be played through that process. And also the last one is state rules protecting groundwater. Those issues still remain unresolved, I might add, in the Polymet case, are certain to come up for any tailings disposal facility at the Twin Metals site. And so all of these are important legal issues that were litigated on Polymet, are not fully resolved there yet, but are certain to become issues in a Twin Metals legal fight.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to keep in mind here is that these decisions are precedential decisions from the courts that govern future interpretation of these laws for any mine, including Twin Metals. All right, I want to turn now to the last one, the federal permit related to wetlands destruction. This is often referred to as the 404 permit because it's under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and it governs when and how companies may damage or destroy wetlands in their development and what the requirements are around that. This permit's issued by the Army Corps of Engineers with insight as well from EPA. So I'm wondering, Chris, if you can tell us a little bit about what happened with that permit.
Sure. Thank you, Catherine. And to kick this off, I will share a screen here so people get a sense of what we're talking about here. And so this is the Polymet site. This is the Polymet site. Historically, it was known as the 100-mile swath. So you have lots and lots and lots of wetlands here. And so Polymet would have been the largest permitted destruction of wetlands in Minnesota's history. And so it would have impacted over 900 acres directly and another 6,000 acres indirectly. So if you can imagine this, what you do is you dig a big hole in the ground here, and then the water in the surrounding landscape would be sucked out. So you'd be drying out, dewatering, impacting the hydrology in the surrounding landscape. And so in 2019, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers approved that wetlands destruction permit under the Clean Water Act, Section 404. And then the fund continued. Yeah. So we at Friends of the Boundary Waters filed the lawsuit in 2019, but the real hero of the story in stopping this wetlands destruction permit is the Fond du Lac Band. So in 2021, the Fond du Lac Band requested a hearing before the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers challenging that permit. And the Fond du Lac Band really challenged it on 2 grounds, two violations. One was mercury, and the second was specific conductance. And so what happens when you when you make this big hole in the ground here, that elemental mercury gets mobilized in the water as methyl mercury and gets into the water system. Already in northeastern Minnesota, you have 10% of the population that has elevated levels of mercury, and so this is a huge problem for the communities up there. And mercury bioaccumulates through the food chain, and for people who rely on subsistence fishing, this is a huge health issue. It's a neurotoxin and impacts the development of brains in infants and young children. And the second violation that the Fond du Lac ban pointed out was it would violate specific conductivity. And that, I know that seems pretty odd, because specific conductivity is the ability of water to conduct electricity. And so why would you have a standard for that? That when water can conduct electricity better, it means there are more dissolved solids, minerals and other contaminants in the water. And so the higher that specific conductivity is, the better water can conduct electricity. It means there are greater total dissolved solids in there. So those were the two violations asserted by the Fond du Lac ban. There was a hearing in 2022 that the Army Corps of Engineers had, and it was a multi-day hearing, 3 days. Over 20,000 comments were submitted to the Army Corps of Engineers on this, and the Fond du Lac ban won. And so the Army Corps of Engineers looked at this and said, you know what, as designed, there's no way that this can be, that you can avoid these impacts on the Fond du Lac ban's water quality standards. And so in 2023, that federal wetlands destruction permit was tossed out, and that remains the status right now. What's going on with the Trump administration part 2 here is that they've established what they call a fast tracking of several projects around the country, and the Polymet project is on there. And so what we're looking at is perhaps in 2027 there will be additional supplemental environmental documentation presented by the Army Corps of Engineers on this. But right now, the Army Corps of Engineers determined that there was no way to redesign this project to avoid the violations of the Fond du Lac ban's water quality standards. So it was a huge victory. It was at a federal forum, and is really significant as we consider twin metals and other future sulfide mining projects in Minnesota.
Yeah, and it's helpful when we have these strong statements from previous permits and permit withdrawals when we think about what a future administration might do. So I want to shift to that. Obviously, Twin Metals has been closely watching what happened in Polymet, as have we, and they will try to learn from these mistakes. We won't see the same mistakes. We won't see things repeated. And of course, we have a different federal administration in office that is changing things rapidly. And so both of these things could make our work harder. So I want to turn to the guests to ask each of you to spend a little time talking about what might be different with Twin Metals this time around. I'm going to start with Joy. Joy, we've seen this administration take a lot of action through executive authority, or at least try to. There's almost a daily rhythm of executive orders and statements and proclamations. And many of these are related to mining and streamlining permits. So can you talk a little bit about what's happening with executive authority at the federal level and how it might affect Twin Metals?
Yes, for sure. So yes, having an administration that clearly wants to prioritize mining and is willing to issue all sorts of executive orders to attempt to clear the path for mining, that is something that is new for us. We are going to have opposition at the federal level. We are not going to have the kinds of federal help necessarily from the Army Corps of Engineers, from the EPA that we had in some of these other things that we've been talking about. So the Trump administration, especially in the first few months, Trump issued an executive order that declared an energy emergency. And then along with that, there was a whole slew of executive orders that did things like tell agencies to speed up environmental review, speed up permitting, open up federal lands to mineral exploration and mining, and weaken rules that protect natural resources. So all this flood of orders came out. And one really important change was to environmental review. The Department of Interior issued guidelines that said that environmental review should happen in 28 days, which, as you heard earlier, environmental review for something as complicated as a sulfide mine obviously usually takes multiple years. At the same time, the federal government revoked entirely, just got rid of all of the federal rules that tell federal agencies how environmental review works. So some of the agencies have their own, but it was the overarching rules, those are gone. And so what could that mean this time around? For Twin Metals, it could mean that there is a very fast federal environmental review, followed by very quickly by permitting. However, I think that even Twin Metals realizes that that would be a bad idea because lawyers don't like to speak in absolutes. I don't like to predict things, but I'm going to say that it would be impossible to do an actually adequate environmental review of something as complex as a sulfide mine in 1 month. Just not possible. And so that review is going to lack a lot of things, and permits that are based on it are also going to lack a lot of things. And so I think if that happens, Twin Metals will be spending that time fighting in court that maybe would have been spent better on the front end getting a good environmental review. However, for the state, what this means is that if Twin Metals is able to obtain federal environmental review, federal permits really quickly, it is very likely to turn around and come back to the state and say, hey, the Fed said this mine is clean. The Fed said this mine can go forward. You have to get on board with this, state, and give us the permits that we're asking for and speed up your environmental review. And the fact is, no, we do not have to do that. Minnesota has its own state laws that are completely independent of what's happening at the federal level. We have the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act that says how you have to do environmental review. We have state laws that talk about what our permitting requirements are. And those things are not satisfied by an inadequate federal environmental review and inadequate federal permitting. So yes, there's going to be changes at the federal level, but we still have our state laws that we can use to fight back.
Yeah. And there's some questions about who does the environmental review. And the answer is there is both a federal environmental review process and a state environmental review process. And what Joy is talking about is a scenario where they actually get separated and the federal review happens really fast and is not very good. The state still has its own environmental review that's administered by the DNR. The federal one would probably be Forest Service, I would think, although it could be BLM, I'm not sure. But at the state level, DNR is the primary agency, and PCA would be very involved too, because they also have to issue permits. And so typically you want this all to happen in one big process, and that's in theory, that should be more efficient. If you separated them, there are pretty big downsides to that, because then you have to do both twice. The fact that the federal one was fast and weak doesn't mean that the state one will be. The law remains the same at the state level, and the process remains the same at the state level. All right, so that's kind of that interaction between the federal government and some of the concerns there. So this is, I'll open it we'll go to Aaron first. So presumably, Twin Metals is a little savvier. Maybe they learned some stuff around political or communication strategy as well. I mean, what do we see in terms of things Twin Metals might do differently from PolyMet that they might have learned from that experience?
Yeah, good question, Catherine. And of course, we have a lot of experience that we gained through the PolyMet environmental review and permitting process when it comes to public engagement. And just to bring people back in time to late 2013, early 2014, there had been the publication of a supplemental draft environmental impact statement for PolyMet. It's a lot of words, I get it. But this was probably the most important moment for public engagement because it was basically PolyMet's new mine plan that they had spent 3 or 4 years working on, and the first chance for the public to engage with it. And they did in huge numbers. 58,000 people commented on that document through electronic means or through writing. We did a content analysis of those comments and found that 98% of them were opposed to the mine. There were 3 public hearings and near Babbitt, and then also one in St. Paul and one in Duluth. Over 4,000 people attended those 3 public hearings in the dead of winter. The one in St. Paul had over 3,000 people there, and that was on a day when St. Paul canceled school because it was so cold that it wasn't safe for kids to go. So huge amounts of public interest, and it really changed the public conversation, and eventually, I think, the legal conversation about this mine. And I think there is going to be efforts to try to control that because of how successful that public organizing was in getting people's concerns up and also giving them a chance to have their say on the mine proposal that was in front of them. So there are lots of ways that that might happen. There might be shorter public comment periods. In the case of the Polymet supplemental draft comment period, I think it was 150 days, which is about 5 months. And that's a long time for a public comment period. You might see one that's 60 days or less this time around. You might see a smaller number of public meetings or public meetings that are only near the mine site as opposed to ones in the Twin Cities or in Duluth. You might also see the use of websites that try to limit how many comments can come in through like email forms and make it difficult for organizations like MCEA and Friends of the Boundary Waters to organize people through our software and our technology to get people engaged in the process. But more generally, like I think we'll see a lot of the same kind of messaging that we saw from agencies back at that time, which was to tell people that, okay, this is not about you voting for or against the mine. This is about technical issues and how we resolve them. But I encourage everybody who's listening today to think about your voice as being your voice and you have a chance to exercise it. Don't let anyone tell you what you can or can't say about a mine proposal. Don't let anyone tell you if you're not an expert, you don't have a say in what happens to the future of Lake Superior or the Boundary Waters. You do. Those are resources that are yours and are collectively resources that the public all owns. But one last thing I'll say is that we also saw in 2018 on a Twin Metals proposal, the company and its supporters started to boycott public meetings. They knew they couldn't win in the public messaging because they didn't have enough people showing up. So you might see that too. But there will certainly be an effort to try to constrain public input. And we will fight really hard to make sure that the public's voice can be heard and that you have every opportunity to weigh in on what the proposals are, whether it's Twin Metals, Polymet / New Range, or Tamarack. One last thing I'll just add is that the first one of these comment periods likely to come is going to come this summer, and it'll probably be around Tamarack. We don't have a final date around that, but this will be a chance to kind of see how the DNR is approaching a public comment period on a sulfide mine. And it'll be a chance for organizations like MCEA, Water Over Nickel, Friends of the Boundary Waters, everybody who is concerned about sulfide mining to see how our strategies work to try to maximize public engagement, because that's our goal, to get your voice heard in these proposals.
Yeah, yeah. And so, Chris, to you, I mean, with this federal administration, it seems very clear that we need a strong state strategy, that we need people participating in these processes, as Aaron's describing. And that also might be a while, as Joy told us on Twin Metals. So what do we do now? Like, I think everyone on the call is probably asking this question, like, what can I do now to help protect our water?
Sure. There are a few things. Step one is to put pressure on Governor Walz to cancel the Twin Metals state mineral lease. So the Twin Metals project requires federal mineral leases and state mineral leases. And right now, before our state, there's a Twin Metals mineral lease that the state entered into in 1990 that provides that in year 36 of that lease, the state of Minnesota has the right to cancel it if there's been no production. And that year 36 is this year, 2026. And back in February, we sent this letter to DNR saying, cancel this lease. And this is really focusing what we can do, and where the executive branch in this state can't point the finger at the judiciary or legislative branches, and so this is not a silver bullet for killing the Twin Metals mine, but it is incredibly important for these reasons. First, it sets a precedent for the other mineral leases that come up for potential cancellation in 10, 11, and 12 years. So its precedential value is incredibly important, that if the state of Minnesota does not exercise its authority now, well, then it's setting the table for these future actions. The second is that this Twin Metals has been doing exploratory drilling all around this site this past winter. It very much looks at this as a a potential area for when it comes back and revises mine plan, it would include it there. So this could be a very a key dimension of its overall plan for mining this area. So the precedential value, and that this remains a potential key component of the overall plan for Twin Metals. So that is the first step. So, but it's not the next step is that we must pass laws in Minnesota to protect the boundary waters and our clean water. There has not been a hearing by the Minnesota legislature on this topic since 2009. I mean, it's extraordinary. This is true civic and legislative malpractice. And so we really need to demand that our elected officials in Minnesota stand up for Minnesota. And so there are four pieces of legislation that we're advancing. The sort of base layer protection that would protect all of Minnesota's waters from sulfide mining is the Prove It First law. And that is very simple and common sense. It would require any of these sulfide mining companies to point to one example where this type of mining has been done safely elsewhere in the country, where it's operated for 10 years and been closed for 10 years without polluting, before it's done here in Minnesota. So we don't want to make Minnesota the guinea pig. The second law is the permit protection law that focuses on the Rainy River watershed where the Twin Metals project is proposed, and it would ban permanently any of this type of mining on state lands where state mineral leases, and it would prevent state permits in that Rainy River watershed. So it's sort of the state equivalent to federal legislation that Congresswoman Betty McCollum has tried to advance at the federal level. The third piece of legislation is the bad actor bill. The parent companies of Twin Metals and Polymet, Antofagasta in Chile and Glencore in Switzerland, are bad corporate actors. And the state of Minnesota does not have to let bad corporate actors operate in Minnesota. It's like keeping a doctor that has a malpractice claim elsewhere in another state from operating in Minnesota. So that bad actor bill would keep those companies out of Minnesota. And then finally, kind of getting back into some of the Polymet issues, is the taxpayer protection law. The way the Polymet permit was written, it put the burden of environmental liability on Minnesota taxpayers. And so the taxpayer protection bill would simply require these foreign mining conglomerates to put the cash up front for financial assurance. And it would make these mines not economically viable, but it would protect Minnesota taxpayers from that environmental liability. So cancel the lease, pass laws, and then finally vote that we have an election coming up in November, and we need to, for candidates for office here in Minnesota, we need to make sure that they stand up for clean water and for the boundary waters. And so we at Friends of the Boundary Waters have an affiliate, Friends of the Boundary Waters Action Network, that supports candidates for elected office. So those are the big three. Vote, pass legislation, then cancel the lease. So.
Thanks, Chris. And it really emphasizes like how central our governor, our next governor, and our legislature are in this decision. There are a lot of things that can be done, and we need to ratchet up the pressure to do them at this moment, now that in the face of this federal vote. All right, so quite possibly, Minnesota could be facing 3 active copper sulfide mine proposals in the years ahead. We've got a lot to do. What do you think lawyers can do in this fight, Joy? Let's start there.
Yeah, well, luckily we are ready. MCEA and Friends and a lot of our allies have been working on these cases now for several decades. We have built up an expertise in what a mine can do and what kinds of pollution it creates. We've got relationships with experts that we can have testify. And we are going to keep doing the same thing that we've been doing all along. We are going to be telling people how they can get involved, like Chris just did. We are going to be engaging in the environmental review and permitting processes to do all that we can to push the state to comply with its own laws and put in conditions that actually protect natural resources. And where we see problems with permits that don't protect natural resources, we're going to bring lawsuits because I've got multiple litigators at MCEA, and we all really like to file lawsuits. It's really exciting when we get to do that. And so we are ready. We are happy to do that.
All right. Thanks, Joy. Yep, that's why we hired them. All right. What about you, Chris? Your organization's been very central to this work for many years. What role do you see your organization playing?
Well, we see the role right now is moving the debate to the state level, and that we have agency here in Minnesota, that the federal government did what the federal government did, and we won't be able at the federal level until after the 2028 elections to make a difference. So we'll be working at the federal level, moving to making an impact in 2029, and doing the behind the scenes work of developing a movement at the federal level. But at the state level, we'll be we'll be taking agency of our future. And this is part of the larger narrative that where Minnesota has been standing up for Minnesota in the face of a reckless federal government. And so the literally hundreds of thousands of messages that we've received in the last 3 weeks here tells me that people in Minnesota are ready to stand up and do the things that we've asked. Cancel the lease, pass laws that protect the boundary waters and clean water, and elect boundary waters champions and clean water champions. So though it's within that broader narrative of Minnesota standing up for Minnesota against the federal government. And as part of that, underlying that, for all the more than 600 people that are on this, you are really the heroes. This is how we make a difference, and we're really creating a movement. It's not about an organization as such, but a movement of people that are committed to this, and that's really the inspiration from the passage of House Joint Resolution 140. I view it as like a tactical defeat, but a strategic victory, because the movement is here. The movement is here right now, and we're creating a movement of businesses, organizations, faith institutions, and citizens that are going to protect our water. So for everyone out there, I am so grateful for you. You are the hero of creating this movement. So.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's so true. Lawsuits and political action don't work in a vacuum. We have to have all of the people behind us. We need all of you, and that's brought us a lot of the success we've had so far. All right, Aaron, I'm going to give you the last word before we go to Q&A. What else can our viewers do? How can they get engaged?
I won't repeat all the great things you've already heard from Chris and Joy, but I'll just add one more, which you might not think of as being a form of activism, but it is. Visit the Boundary Waters. Go there and bring someone new. Help expose other people to what's up there. Some of the most rewarding things that I've done is bringing new people who've never been in a wilderness area on wilderness trips and helping them understand, first of all, why this area is so special, but also what they can do to protect it. Because I think ultimately for us to protect the boundary waters, there have to be, and there is, a legion of people who love it and want to protect it. And so getting out there and actually enjoying and sharing that resource with other people is a really important way for us to expand our reach. Remember, this vote just happened in Congress, but the people who decided it were not all Minnesotans. And so that national and international reach of how important and wonderful this area is a big part of protecting it. Otherwise, yeah, push for legislation and talk to your elected officials and people who want to be your elected official right now. There's a whole bunch of internal party processes in both the Republican and Democratic parties happening right now. This is a great time to ask candidates what they're going to do to protect the boundary waters, what they're going to do to protect clean water for everybody, what they're going to do to protect Lake Superior and the Mississippi River. So please make sure you ask candidates that want to represent you what they're going to do to protect those resources that you care about.
Yeah, thank you. All right, that's great. All right, we have over 100 questions in the Q&A, so not going to lie, we're not going to get to a lot of these questions in 10 minutes. But I'm seeing a few themes, so I'm going to group it under a few themes. The first big theme is about this U.S. Senate vote on the Congressional Review Act, and essentially, like, what can we do about it? Can it be reversed? Can it be legally challenged? Can it be reversed? Like, are there options or paths on this U.S. Senate vote? Maybe I'll start with Joy on this one, on this question of is there a litigation strategy?
Sure, yeah. So groups are definitely researching this and looking into this right now. As probably a lot of you know on this call, this was a really unprecedented use of the Congressional Review Act. Usually it is used for rules that are passed, and then you have to notify Congress about these rules, and then Congress has 60 days to decide whether to repeal it. But in this case, no one had ever said that a mineral withdrawal like this counted as the kind of rule that needed to be notified to Congress. And so there's definitely a potential legal issue here where is this subject to the Congressional Review Act at all? And so I think that that is the next step for this, is that challenging that in court and figuring out whether a court would say, yeah, you did this right, or no, that you can't do it that way.
Hmm. And what about, maybe I'll send this to you, Aaron. What about like a political strategy? I mean, can this be undone by a future president or a future Congress?
Well, if the Congressional Review Act is used and it's upheld, future administrations cannot use the same action to do the same thing. And so this would prohibit a future administration, a future president, from using the same administrative route to withdraw minerals. It does not prevent Congress from doing it, though. Congress can pass a law at any time withdrawing federal mineral rights from a particular area, and they do that quite frequently. That's been done at Yellowstone and Grand Canyon, and it can be done here in the Boundary Waters. And so there's still definitely a federal issue at play here. And there, despite the lack of legal clarity about the use of the Congressional Review Act, we always know that Congress can pass laws to undo the laws that a past Congress passed. And that's in this case also still true. So the federal government's not done here, but it may cut off the administrative route in the future unless these legal challenges are successful.
Yeah. Anything to add there, Chris?
Sure, just to add to what Aaron just said, that there is legislation in Congress. It's going nowhere right now, but it's been introduced by Betty McCollum to do just that. To, instead of doing it through the administrative process, doing it through the legislative process, and protecting the Rainy River watershed from this type of mining on federal lands. So that is the vehicle. There's a companion bill in the Senate introduced by Tina Smith, and so that's what we would be building toward. That would be the legislative victory that we would aim for in 2029, and building the momentum for that.
Hmm. And I'll note as well, I mean, this model of using the Congressional Review Act in this way could be used for other land management and wilderness decisions made by previous administrations, like sort of going back however long somebody wanted to, if this legal theory was correct. And I think a lot of folks have concern about that. So I could also envision in future years somebody trying to modify the Congressional Review Act to prevent this kind of use of it and limit it to the original vision of sort of a new legislature acting on things that a lame duck president it did in their final days before leaving office, which is really what this was for. All right, so another big category of questions is basically around federal versus state law. Folks have a lot of dire and actually frighteningly creative ideas in our Q&A about what could the federal government do to sort of overwhelm, preempt, undermine state authority. So rather than explore all those scenarios, let's maybe start with sort of generally, like, what do we know about like the federal administration's ability to do anything to interfere with state processes right now? Can they, are they able, or based on what we know at the moment, can they come in and just permit a mine without state authority? Would that work?
No.
Maybe that. Okay. Is that a Joy question? Okay. No.
Sure, I'll take it. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, so generally, yes, if there's a conflict between federal and state law, yes, generally federal law will win. But the preemption happens in order for a federal law to preempt a state law. There has to be either something express in the law that says we don't want any state action on this, or the federal government the federal law covers the area so thoroughly that there's no room for state regulation. And that is not the way that federal mining permits, or how mining or other kinds of permits like this have worked. Generally, there is a recognition in federal statutes that relate to mining that there is a place for state authority. And there is a Supreme Court case that talks about the fact that environmental regulations from a state, even on federal on mining on federal land, are okay. Like there's room for the state to come in and regulate this. What is this administration going to do? I can't predict that. Things that I never thought I would see are happening all the time. But right now, based on the state of the law, based on what laws Minnesota has, based on how this has always gone, Minnesota has a place to play here and is able to say no to this mine if it is not sufficiently protective of the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on that from Aaron or Chris? Nothing to add. Okay. Okay, one other theme that's coming up is some of the arguments that mining companies make to justify their processes. And in particular, we've heard for years these arguments about the need for metals for a clean energy transition, right? They go into wind turbines or solar panels, or electric vehicles is a big one. And we have also seen a shift in that messaging in recent years. I'm wondering, I want to send this one to Chris maybe, because you've seen some of this around twin metals. What is the link to clean energy, if at all, and how are we seeing that change?
Sure, twin metals and these other foreign mining conglomerates try to advance a narrative. So during the Biden administration, when people still talked about climate change, it was that, we need these minerals to address climate change. Back in early 2024, when it became obvious that Biden would not be reelected, with the prediction in the office was, this will change to, we need it for national defense. And sure enough, after Trump was elected, it became the word critical minerals, which has became the buzzword. And so it's fitting the zeitgeist of the moment that we need critical minerals. And both of those are fallacious claims, as it is erroneous. And so for us on the narrative is to focus on Minnesota has a clean water heritage, and kind of that is the starting point that, we have the boundary waters with over 1,000 lakes. We have the greatest of the Great Lakes with Lake Superior, and we are the headwaters of the Mississippi River. And we need to start there and go from there. And that talk about how these mines will always pollute, and that if we're going to have a debate, it's about how much, if this pollution is worth the benefits, and reassert the importance of tribal rights, and then finally that Minnesota it can stand up to a reckless federal government. So that's the narrative that we're using to stand up for these misleading narratives put forth by Twin Metals and the other sulfide mining companies. So
Minnesota can stand up to a reckless federal government. I am going with that, Chris, to close us out. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who came today. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your many really interesting questions, but I know you'll keep following us on this issue, and that we will continue this conversation. This is a key moment. Our organizations need your support more than ever. The next few years are going to be crucial. We need advocacy organizations, we need lawyers, and we need all of you in this fight. So thank you. Our next webinar, Protecting Our Wetlands from National Cuts to Minnesota's Moment, will be on May 20th. So we'd love to have you join that one as well. The role of wetlands in protecting our water and climate is extraordinary. Right now, they need our protection, not just from mines, but from other threats as well. And there's a link in our chat that you can RSVP. So thank you again for supporting this work. We genuinely can't do it without you. Have a good afternoon.